Hello, everyone, and welcome to AP US History for Winners with your teacher, Mr. Johnson. Last time we finished up Unit 8, which spanned 1945 to 1980, and today we are going to talk about our last unit, Unit 9. This unit spans from 1980 to the mid 2000s. Specifically, today we're going to talk about President Reagan and this idea of conservatism. So, if you are ready, let's begin. First, let's do a little bit of review of conservative beliefs. A good thing to kind of have in your head about 1980s conservatives is this little quote: faith, flag, and family. And those are kind of the cornerstones of conservative beliefs. So we're thinking about things like a religious focus, smaller government, enhancing property rights for individuals. They want to make sure that we have a stable society, high family values. And it's important to note that conservatives have a large impact on society from 1980 on through today, right? And their impact is really focused again on culture, economics, and then shifting that political debate, which we talked a little bit about last time. So, Ronald Reagan is going to win in 1980 against Jimmy Carter, and we need to understand why Ronald Reagan wins. And he's pictured here on the left. He is one of the most popular presidents during his time. So, why does he win? Well, the evangelical Christian movement really helped support him. We talked about their influence of that last time. People also really disliked Jimmy Carter, who was running again for nomination. There was a lot of issues with the economy. People had a lot of issues with his foreign policy. People thought he was weak on communism. If you remember that Iran hostage crisis we talked about, he was not able to get the hostages returned during his presidency. And so there was a lot of people who disliked him. And a lot of white working class people ended up switching political parties from being a Democrat, which they had historically been, to now being a Republican. So Reagan really starts to bring in the shift to what we think of in these political parties. Reagan is also thought of as a lot more of an optimistic person. In his speeches, he's talking about, America as an optimistic place. And then last, I want you to remember that Sun Belt region that we had talked about before, the south part of the United States, especially the Southwest, was a very popular base for conservatives, and it really helped vault Ronald Reagan to victory. Now let's take a little electoral college map, and this is 1980. So Jimmy Carter was the incumbent president, right? So he had already won once, and you expect incumbents to usually win again. And you can see by this map, this was a huge landslide victory for Ronald Reagan. He gets 90% of the electoral votes. Jimmy Carter only wins a few states. While he did get 40% of the votes, Jimmy Carter only wins a few states. So you can see a wide amount of America was in favor of Ronald Reagan. So Reagan's victory is considered a milestone, a watershed election. It is very important to know that this is really a big point to transform the Republican Party and conservative beliefs. And with his victory, conservatives are going to enact a few things. One of the major things that they're going to enact is tax cuts. And we need to understand this term right here, Reaganomics. Sometimes it's called supply side or trickle-down economics, but it's often nicknamed after Ronald Reagan, Reaganomics. We got to make sure we understand this term. So what this is the idea that if they cut taxes for the wealthy, for the people who own the businesses, that it will stimulate economic growth. So the thought, again, is if they cut taxes on the rich, that they will be able to provide more jobs and they will increase wages for everybody else. They also, in the 1980s, they cut interest rates. So they make it easier for people to borrow money. And we see a lot of similar tax policies to the policies of the 1920s, which that's a good thing to keep in mind if you're trying to compare eras. We see the 1980s economy. We can see some similarities to the 1920s. And last, another thing that Reagan does is he deregulates a lot of industries, means take a lot of the rules and regulations that businesses had to follow, takes them away. So, for example, banks, oil companies, and airlines were all deregulated. For example, he ended the price controls on oil, which were in place. So he's opening up more to a free market, more laissez-faire economics, right? Not entirely, but more to back to that idea is what Ronald Reagan did with his victory. Now, obviously, not everyone's going to agree with those decisions. And so we are going to see conservatives and liberals, again, having disagreements and debates about these policies. So conservatives are going to argue that liberal programs are counterproductive, that liberal programs don't actually fight poverty, they don't actually stimulate the economy. Um, and they think that some of the efforts to reduce the size and scope of the government were met with opposition by liberals, right? And so that's kind of an important idea. The conservatives want to bring the government smaller, but liberals are not always going to be in favor of that. All right, so one thing that Reagan does as a conservative, he signs the Family Support Act to fight poverty. This is a job training program and a child care assistance program. So this is one way that he is giving still social support. And Reagan actually does a lot to save the liberal policies of Social Security. He passes something called the Social Security Reform Act, which makes sure that Social Security has more reform. And remember, that's a policy that's been in American government since FDR, but it is a liberal policy. It is a big government policy. So it's not like Reagan is entirely on one side, right? And the reason, another thought I should say that Reagan has is he does feel like, and conservatives do feel like at the time, that a lot of people are taking advantage of government programs like food stamps or subsidized housing. So they're trying to make sure they can find ways to ensure that the people who are getting these really do need them. Now, with all that said, and this is a really important idea to know, liberal social programs are still very popular. Social Security, which is money that you pay into with the job and then you get that money back when you retire, it also helps for unemployment. Medicare and Medicaid, these are health programs for people who are old or who are below a certain income level. And food stamps, which helps people low income get access to food. They are still very popular programs. And so that is important to know that some of these liberal ideas are really popular. And that's why we kind of see Reagan doesn't take away all of these ideas. And then AP does also want us to know that Reagan's plans end up hurting the lower and middle classes. These ideas of Reaganomics do end up hurting the lower and middle class. We see the poverty rate increase from 12% to 15%. We see unemployment rise from 7% to 11%. But conservatives would think that Reagan's ideas in the long run would help benefit everybody in America. So now we're going to kind of go through a few electoral college maps because I know last unit I didn't do a great job of this. So I want to make sure you know who's president during which time so we can kind of see. So we already know Reagan was president from 80 to 84. And so then in 1984, he runs again against Walter Mondale, the Democrat. And you can see it's even a bigger landslide election for Reagan. So he still maintains his popularity. Almost the entire country is voting for Ronald Reagan. Okay. So he's president from 1980 to 1988. And because he can't run for a third term, someone named George H.W. Bush, the Republican, is going to run against a Democrat, Dukakis, okay? And the Republican wins again. Now, a lot of people see this as maybe George H.W. Bush, while he was an esteemed politician, that maybe he was kind of riding the popularity of Ronald Reagan, because this is still a very big landslide election, all right? So after Reagan, for 8 years, we see George H.W. Bush be president from 88, and then he runs again in 1992, but he does not win. All right. So George H.W. Bush only wins one term. And in 1992, we see the Democrats take control again with Bill Clinton. Okay. And so you can see if we go back to the 1988 map to the 1992 map, the Democrats are doing much better all of a sudden. And one of the reasons that people might think that the Democrats do better in 1992 is if you look at the popular vote, we see a third party get a significant amount of the vote. This guy named Ross Perot was part of this Reform Party, and he did take away a lot of Republican and conservative votes that voted for him instead of voting for H.W. Bush. And this kind of Clinton wins the election with only 42% of the popular vote. But we don't use the popular vote, we use the Electoral College. So Bill Clinton is a Democrat, wins in 92, and then he wins again in 1996. So Bill Clinton is the president from 92 all the way to 2000. And then the last election we'll talk about is the election in 2000. And this is where Bill Clinton can't run again. His vice president, Al Gore, runs against the Republican son of George H.W. Bush. This is George W. Bush. So this is his son, and he runs in 2000, and he wins. But this is one of the closest elections ever. As you can tell, the Democrat and the popular vote actually got more votes than the Republican. But with the Electoral College at the top, that's what decides the president, right? And so that's why George W. Bush ends up winning. Again, the son of George H.W. Bush, the Republican, he ends up winning. And so very, very close election. Again, there's a Green Party here. Ralph Nader, he got 3% of the vote. It's not as significant as the one we just saw with Ross Perot, but people think that people who vote for Green Party would maybe have voted for Democrats. So they think maybe that's why this election went for the Democrats. So we see in these election cycles in the 90s, we see the influence of third parties a lot. Okay. All right. So I just wanted to make sure we kind of went over that briefly so you can kind of see the political structure and who's winning in these different elections. And George W. Bush is going to be the last main president that we talk about for this lesson. All right. So let's talk a little bit more about policy debates and what people are kind of disagreeing with each other on. So there's a lot of debate over this idea of free trade agreements. And I want you to bold this one, make sure you understand this one. The North American Free Trade Agreement, often called NAFTA, which was signed in 1994 under the Democratic President Bill Clinton that we just talked about. And what this does is it says there are no tariffs on goods made or traded between America, Canada, and Mexico. So this is making it very easy to trade between these countries. But a lot of people don't agree with this idea. They think that there should be tariffs. A lot of, especially conservatives, think that there should be tariffs so that people are buying more American-made goods. But this makes trade easier. This is something that, again, people are debating. There's also, what else are they debating? They're also debating the scope of the government social safety net. So how much should the government provide for the people who are struggling? And so in 1996, they had welfare reform. This is again under Bill Clinton. So some people are viewing that the public became too dependent on government assistance. All right, so this instituted time limits on welfare assistance and made it harder to get that welfare. So last, there is calls to reform the financial system with deregulation. Okay, so in 1999, Bill Clinton passes the Financial Services Modernization Act in 1999, and this again deregulates the banking industry. It separates investment banking from real retail banking, and a lot of people might think, or they argue that maybe this had to do with the 2008 financial crash. But as we see with Reagan and even with Clinton, Republicans and Democrats, we see a lot of movement towards deregulating a lot of the economy and getting a lot of the government out of the economy. All right, last thing we're going to talk about for today is some political and cultural debates, some things that, again, conservatives and liberals are talking about and debating. So immigration becomes a big topic during the 80s and 90s and early 2000s. People are thinking about the path to citizenship. How do people become citizens if they got here illegally? There's this idea of amnesty that a lot of Democrats bring up, which is basically a way to pardon people who are illegal immigrants. Should they be, they're here, they've been living here for so many years. Should we just make them citizens? So that's an idea that people are debating. And then we see the idea of a border wall, and this even takes us all the way through Trump, but it was a popular idea to discuss and debate during the 1980s, 90s, and early 2000s as well. Like, should there be a wall between the border between between the United States and Mexico? Education is another hotly debated topic. In 2002, George W. Bush, the son of George H.W. Bush, passes this law called No Child Left Behind. And this law holds schools accountable for how kids are learning and how much they achieve. The law is very controversial and eventually gets doesn't get repassed later on, but it's controversial because it penalizes schools that don't show improvement. And so some people felt, well, those are the schools that actually need more help. But it was a way that the government's getting more involved in education. And again, people are debating, is this good or bad? And the last big cultural debate here, political debate, would be gay rights that I want to talk to you about. So there is this policy that Bill Clinton has called Don't Ask, Don't Tell in the military. And this starts in 1993 and it lasts until 2011. And this is a policy that prohibits military personnel from discriminating or harassing homosexual or bisexual service members or applicants. So they're not allowed to discriminate. But if you are openly gay or lesbian or bisexual, you could not be in the military. So it's this idea, well, we're not going to ask if you are gay or lesbian, but if you are, then you are, if you're openly saying it, then you're not allowed to serve. And that policy is, again, we're kind of seeing this slow, gradual trend towards more acceptance. And then there's the debate of the legalization of same-sex marriage. And a lot of states pass laws that allow same-sex marriage to happen. Before in 2015, it becomes a nationwide law, okay, that every state has to allow it. So again, the gay rights issue, we see that as being a slow argument that is progressing more and more towards equality through the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. All right. So that is it for our notes on Ronald Reagan and these ideas of conservatism and the debates and arguments we're having with liberals during the time. So let's go over the big ideas. Number one, explain conservative beliefs in the 1980s to today and be specific about one conservative belief. Number two, explain the liberal opposition to conservatism from the 1980s to today and be specific about one way that liberals are opposing conservatives. And number three, describe policy, political, and cultural debates from the 1980s to today and be specific about one of those debates. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you next time.